Hello, everyone, and welcome to the PAIR Symposium 2020. I'm Fernanda Viégas. I'm one of the hosts today. I'm a principal scientist at Google Research and one of the founders of Google PAIR, the People Plus AI Research Initiative. We're so excited that you are all here. We have a packed day today. I'm talking to you live from London today, but we actually have 3 sessions. If we could go to the next slide. Yes, so I am, as I said, talking to you from London, and we have an amazing panel that is going to start very soon on exploring boundary objects in technology. Afterwards, there will be a session in Boston at 10 a.m. East time, so local time, Boston time, on exploring objective functions as boundary objects. And then finally, we're gonna wrap up the day with a session in Seattle on exploring participatory ML boundary objects in the field. So you may have noticed that we have a theme going on with boundary objects today, and we'll get to that. We'll explain what we mean by boundary objects. But before we do that, I'd like to tell you a little bit of our agenda, just a little bit of logistics. So today, we're going to do the introduction and welcome, which I'm doing right now. We're going to jump in a series of lightning talks from our 4 panelists in the panel I'm about to moderate. And right after their talks, we are going to come back live with all 5 of us, myself and the 4 panelists. I'm really looking forward to that conversation. And then afterwards, there is a little break. And then afterwards, there are a number of breakout sessions. These are sessions that are not going to be live streamed. They're supposed to be more intimate conversations, and people have signed up for those. We got way more folks signing up than we anticipated, so we apologized if you have tried to sign up for one of the breakout sessions, but you weren't able to. This is the first time we do a virtual symposium, so we're learning as we go along. Next, please. The other thing I wanted to say is that captions are going to be available throughout our event today, and you can get this URL. It's also listed in the YouTube live stream description. Okay, and with that, next, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that we're definitely living through a unique time in history with COVID and the pandemic and everybody staying home and doing everything virtually like we are right now. So please, take breaks, take care of yourselves. We try to schedule the day today with a lot of breaks and times in between. Everything also, except for the breakout sessions, is being recorded. So, do what's best for you and go at your own rhythm. And with that, I'd like to pass the words to Kristen Conrad, my colleague at Google, who's going to talk to us about university relations.
Thank you so much, Fernanda. I appreciate it. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I just wanted to take a moment and introduce university relations. As Fernanda mentioned, my name's Kristen Conrad. I'm a program manager on the Google University Relations team, and we have partnered with the organizers of this event to make this possible. I just wanted to take a brief moment to raise awareness about the additional opportunities to potentially partner with the Google University Relations team in the future. Just high level, what we do, we help enable academic collaborations for Google Research, manage and support the interface between academic research and research across Google, promote and support academic research in Google's areas of interest. And we do this for the general good and participating in the ecosystem of academic, industry, and government. We create research results and impacts that would not otherwise be possible and make the world a better place. This symposium and other research is that you all do is a great example of this. And some of the results of that are papers, open source codes, data sets, supports of all researchers across Google. The next slide, please. I just wanted to also share a couple of the different programs that we have. We have a few external research funding opportunities, as well as scientific exchange and building the next generation of researchers. And all of this leads to, again, great outcomes such as papers, the data sets, teaching, and community building. The next slide, please. I just wanted to go into a little bit more detail. For example, the Research Scholar Program we have aims to support early career faculty who are pursuing research in fields relevant to Google. Our Award for Inclusion Research program is a global program which recognizes and supports the academic research in computing or technology of underrepresented populations, as well as our Visiting Researcher program. Googlers can do research with faculty and industry researchers. If any of these would match your needs, and I'd encourage you to reach out to one of the Google researchers that you have connections with, or myself. I have my information on the next slide. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me directly. We also have some resources on the PAIR website as well. So thank you again. Fernanda, back to you.
Thank you so much, Kristen, and thank you for the partnership on putting together the symposium. One of the things I wanted to just briefly touch on is the People Plus AI Research Initiative. Our mandate is to create human-centered AI and really to dig into human-centered research and design in human AI interaction. And we couldn't do this without an amazing team. And so if we go to the next slide, please. This is our team. This is PAIR, and it is a big collaboration through many different parts of Google, a very interdisciplinary team. I'm very proud of that. And actually, a team that exists on a number of places around the planet. So it's one of the other sort of superpowers that we have. It's just having a very international understanding and approach. So if we go to the next slide, what are the kinds of things that PAIR does? We basically think about ourselves as doing three main things. If we go to the next slide, the first thing we do is conduct and publish human AI interaction research. And this takes a number of formats, from academic papers to blog posts to explorable visualizations online, you name it. Next, we also create and launch open source tools and platforms to build AI responsibly. And one of the things that makes me very happy is that we build these tools and we use them ourselves at Google. And then we also open source and share them with the world, which I think is very important. And then finally, if we go to the next slide, we'd like to think that we help widen the circle of who can participate in the development and application of AI. One of the big platforms we have for doing that is both our PAIR Medium channel, but also the People Plus AI guidebook that you see here. This is a guidebook that was published over a year ago, and that is aimed at UXers and managers who are designing and shipping AI-enabled products. And so this is one of the places where we try to come up with very concrete guidelines for doing this kind of work responsibly. So next slide. Today is about boundary objects for participatory machine learning. We designed the whole day around this theme. And so you may be asking yourself, what do you mean by that? It's a bunch of words. So let's go to the next slide. What are boundary objects anyhow? So in this definition of boundary objects, we think about it, coming from sociology. A boundary object is information such as specimens, field notes, and maps used in different ways by different communities. The whole purpose of boundary objects is to bridge between different communities that may have different vocabularies and different understandings of the same either situation or technology or the impact of the technology. And this is something that has existed for many, many years. We believe that this is a very powerful way of thinking about bridges now in AI. There are many different kinds of stakeholders that should be involved in critically thinking and building AI and using it responsibly. And we believe that this notion of boundary objects is one of the very powerful ways we can frame the public debate, or we can make progress in how can we all come together and start speaking a little bit more of the same language. Technologists, engineers, designers, citizens, professionals, you name it. And so today's symposium is going to be devoted to this notion of boundary objects. And with that, I would like to go to the next slide. And as I said, my own session right now is going to be on exploring boundary objects in technology. And if we go to the next slide, I have the honor of speaking with 4 amazing speakers today. And so I want to very briefly introduce each one of them before we watch their presentations. So Charlotte Lee is Associate Professor of Human-Centered Design at the Human-Centered Design and Engineering at the University of Washington. Annelien Bredenoord is Professor of Ethics of Biomedical Innovation at the University Medical Center of Utrecht. And Catherine D'Ignazio is Assistant Professor of Urban Science and Planning at MIT. And finally, Nithya Sambasivan is Staff HCI Researcher at Google Research and one of our very own team members at PAIR. I'm very excited because each one of them brings a different perspective to this notion of boundary objects, as you will see in their talks. And before we move to their talks, can we go to the next slide, please? So as you watch the presentations, please share your questions on this URL here. We're going to be tallying up the questions, and hopefully we'll have time during the panel to ask some of those questions live. Okay, so with that, I think we are now ready to move on to the speakers' presentations.
Hi there, it's wonderful to be here today to talk to you about boundary objects and coordination for creativity and innovation. I've devoted a great deal of my career to the study of boundary objects, so it's really a pleasure to be here on a symposium on the topic. So I was asked to say a few words about how I got started in studying boundary objects. And it really started when I was doing my dissertation work at University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, where I was very inspired by the work of Susan Lee Starr here on the bottom right of the slide, and also the work of my advisor, Phil Agri, up on the top. Both of them were very interested in this notion of how to support people coordinating to get work done in more open-ended situations. And these are situations where people are often collaborating or coordinating to try to innovate, to come up with new knowledge or to come up with new ways of doing things. Both Phil and Lee were interested very much in distributed artificial intelligence. Phil was a product of the MIT AI lab, and as he studied AI, he became rather disillusioned with some of the narrow approaches that focused just on cognition to studying artificial intelligence. In doing my work, I started to get interested in Lee's work on boundary objects. Lee's notions of boundary objects were different from a lot of the other concepts being used at the time and even now. Looking at coordination, a lot of the theories were very, very tied to specific tasks and to specific activities. And Lee's concept of boundary objects was a little broader. She defined them as informational objects that are used by different communities for different purposes and a means of coordination between actors. And this was like a general enough concept that it could be applied everywhere, which is why this concept has been used in many, many different disciplines and cited thousands of times. So the concept of boundary objects Lee put forth was written across a few different papers. The work has been taken up by many, expanded by a few, including myself. And this expansion from the idea of boundary objects tends to take a certain character and flavor, where boundary objects were objects that were to satisfy the informational requirements of each community of practice or group or department and maintained a common identity across sites. So a lot of work, not just my own, on boundary negotiating artifacts sort of said, well, there's other kinds of objects that sit in between communities of practice, groups, departments, that don't necessarily satisfy all the information requirements, that don't have this common identity. And we were expanding to say, like, let's look at other kinds of objects and artifacts, I use those interchangeably, that are used for collaborative sense-making, that are used to negotiate the boundary themselves. And so part of this was that we were looking at different kinds of objects that sit in between, but that we were also looking at different kinds of situations, ones that were a little more ambiguous, where maybe the outcome wasn't determined or the methods weren't really very set. So other ways to think about boundary objects and other ways that the notion of boundary objects have expanded is to think more about epistemic objects. They're technical objects that are ready to hand, that are complete and unproblematic. They tend to be fixed and stable. These are the ones that Lee wrote about the most in those early papers. The follow-on work, including this work by Ewenstein and White, talked a bit more about epistemic artifacts that are characterized by incompleteness, that they're partially expressed, they might have multiple instantiations, and they're continuously evolving. So you may think of like people collaborating around drawings. Maybe they're sketching together, things that you would see in a brainstorming activity. And that these artifacts are often dynamic and able to enable knowledge. Now, it's really important to note that things aren't, just boundary. We don't have situations where it's just boundary objects and just boundary negotiating artifacts or just technical artifacts and just epistemic. But you should think of every collaboration having both of those kinds or multiple kinds. But as you go forth in a workflow, in a design project, you might go from having mostly epistemic objects to mostly technical artifacts. In a lot of the work that we've done thus far as technology developers, mostly we've been focused on technical artifacts because those are easier to instantiate, they're easier to see, they're a little more stable. But a lot of that work that we have to focus on going forward with boundary objects are ones where there are more epistemic objects and more epistemic work to be done. Complicated design projects, scientific research, things like that. So in thinking about these different types of design situations and these different types of artifacts, we also want to think about notions of power. And sometimes when I mention the notion of power to a computational audience, people feel a little uncomfortable because people tend to think of one aspect of power, which is this one on the lower right, this notion of power as domination. But there are other ways to think of power, other definitions. There's power as a resource, meaning something that some have and some don't have, that we want to redistribute or perhaps not, depending on who you are. And power as empowerment. And it's hard to talk about empowerment without also talking about domination. But newer notions about power, like Amy Allen's work on the power of feminist theory, is talking about power as something that's relational. That's something that is being negotiated. And so anytime you think of a set of relationships between people and between artifacts, where things are getting done, decisions are being made, where relationships are being cultivated, you have a situation where we are making decisions about power. We're enacting power. So when we're thinking about relationships, it's useful to think about the things that we build as cultivating relationships. So going back to Phil's work on computation and human experience, which he published in '97, but the work dates back from the late '80s. He talks a lot about algorithms having a social context, about embodied agents having background understanding. Like, I know things about a cultural situation. I know things about the background of the people involved, the history and the values of an organization. And so these need to be taken into account. And similarly, individuals are always creating themselves and their relationships, that these are things that shift and change over time. And so when he was talking about AI, and Lee was talking about AI in terms of distributed artificial intelligence, they are also saying, like, the intelligence exists in these communities of people, right? And how they interact and how they discover together and how they learn together. And so Phil talked about these ways forward for boundary objects and AI. And it's interesting because this work was laid out for us many years ago, but now many of us in CSCW and HCI and other fields are like coming back to this really important work and this really important thinking to look for ways forward. And Phil talked about embracing computation as being part of a history of ideas. If we think of every community as creating ideas and then being part of a history of ideas, to think about the things we create, boundary objects. A data repository, for example, could be a boundary object. Or more specifically, a boundary negotiating artifact most of the time, if it's a living data repository. And we want to make transparent the underlying decisions and assumptions in a moment so that people understand the ramifications of their decisions and assumptions, so they can see what happens when they present a new boundary negotiating artifact. In my original research, looking at a community of museum exhibition developers, there was an immediacy to creating a boundary negotiating artifact. Like, oh, here's a sketch for a new idea. Let's sit around, let's draw on it, let's discuss it, let's fight about it, let's celebrate it. There is this immediate feedback from the design group, and then later from a larger community, where people could see how the decisions were being made, where people could question each other's assumptions. And that there's this ongoing inspection of premises and methods. It's not just, let's lock it down once and then keep it away from the community, that there's this commitment to this ongoing inspection, because there's an ongoing sense making of creating new ways of doing things and new understandings. And again, we're looking at situations that are highly innovative, right? And so this is necessary for that process of innovation. So final thoughts about boundary objects. So objects that AI systems create can provoke and prevent different kinds of conversations. A lot of the ethnographic work that me and my colleagues have been doing are studying what kinds of conversations people have around which sets of boundary objects, which data repositories, which algorithms, which tools. And also this notion that different kinds of conversations implicate different kinds of boundary objects. A lot of the most interesting research we have to do has to do with these epistemic or boundary negotiating artifacts that are much harder to facilitate. How do you facilitate an opening of a design space? And that these different kinds of boundary objects facilitate different kinds of conversations. And part of our decision is to say, what kind of conversations do we want to encourage? And then thinking about how does it change the design space and our priorities when we think about the tools and systems we create as a communal project of sense-making. And not only a communal project of sense-making, but also precedent setting for who gets to have a say when about what and how. In creating tools and systems for coordination, we're already in the mix. We're having discussions about power. And so being mindful about the boundary objects that we're designing and using is really a very powerful way forward in terms of being thoughtful about the things that we produce and the effects that we have on the world. So I want to thank you for your attention today, and also thank my students who made all of this work and this presentation itself possible.
Hello, my name is Annelien Bredenoord, and I would like to introduce myself through this short video. I'm sending this video from my home office in the beautiful city of Utrecht in the middle of the Netherlands. Due to the COVID situation in the Netherlands, we're really restricted in going to our offices. So most people are working, well, many days from home, like me. I'm a bioethics professor at Utrecht University and the University Medical Center Utrecht, but I'm also a politician in the sense that I'm a member of Dutch Senate, Dutch First Chamber. And I should say that we have a bicameral system with a second chamber, and those people are directly elected and they are full-time politicians, and we usually say that the political primate is in the second chamber. But we also have a Senate, a first chamber, and in the Senate there are people like me, although most are a bit older, and senators are actually part-time, like it takes sometimes 10 hours a week, sometimes 20 hours, and we're there for the checks and balances, and we have a final look and a final say over legislation. So it's not primary, it's also political, but it's not primary political, it's primary to look at the quality of legislation. So we have people with different expertise, and so my expertise is in ethics, bioethics particularly, but also broader experience at academia and working in healthcare systems. And I'm interested both from a broader societal perspective, but also from an ethical perspective in emerging technologies. And this, of course, includes technologies such as artificial intelligence, but also reproductive technologies, genomics, genetics, developments in CRISPR-Cas, which means genome editing. I'm doing a lot of work in stem cell research, biobanking, and using data from patients in research. And I think one of the hallmarks of how I have a group, a research group at the University Medical Center in Utrecht, and I think the hallmark of what we are doing is called ethics parallel research. And actually it's a type of early ethics engagement in the development of emerging technologies. And obviously, as I'm particularly centered in a medical center and near a cell biology institute, the Utrecht Institute, it's particularly focused at biomedical developments. And what we aim to realize with ethics parallel research is we would like to guide the development process of technologies in biomedicine, and we aim to provide input for the normative evaluation of such technologies. And we think there are at least 6 ingredients or elements of this type of ethics parallel research, and we're doing this both in practice, but we also theorized this approach as a way that professional ethicists like me can guide the development of new technologies that is sometimes sensitive or controversial. Well, the first element of this approach is what we call the disentangling of wicked problems. So many new technologies raise wicked problems. Think about genome editing, CRISPR-Cas, in which you can modify the germ cells of human embryos, which would mean that an embryo has a different collection of DNA compared where you can modify the DNA of human embryos. And for example, this is a wicked problem because first of all, whether to answer the question, is it safe, is it acceptable, you need many disciplines. It cannot be answered by one single discipline. And second, there is also disagreement about the preferred outcome. So it's a normative question in the sense, and there is political opponents and opposition about these kind of developments. So disentangling, unraveling these type of developments and trying to unravel the arguments, considerations, but also interest, that is the first step that we try to do in this ethics parallel research. And then I think the second element of our approach is what we call upstream or midstream ethical analysis. So I think many people have a prejudice about ethicists working in an ivory tower and telling too late and maybe also too little that a technology is not good for society or not good for people. We have a dramatically different approach because we work really upstream. So I go to international stem cell conferences, AI conferences, reproductive medicine conferences, and we try to start our ethical evaluation and ethical co-production in a very early stage, to become involved in a very early stage, also to show the developers and the researchers that their decisions are not only technical, but particularly also ethical, normative. So we are involved upstream and also midstream. Once the technology hits the ground, is introduced in, for example, a healthcare system, we are interested in what does it do with our perceptions, thoughts, does it affect normative concepts like justice. So for example, we work together with the gynecology department in our hospital. They developed a mobile app for women at risk of, pregnant women at risk of having pre-eclampsia with complications during pregnancy. And so we do a midstream ethical analysis. So once the app is introduced and people use these, pregnant women use the app from the homes, then we start our ethical evaluation and we interview the pregnant women, but also the nurses, the company that's developed the app, the gynecologist, etc. So we work in an early stage of development. Then the third element of this ethics parallel research is that we do ethics from within. And this means that we're not at a large distance from the technology, but we try to unfold our ethical evaluation from within. We work shoulder on shoulder with all the groups of people that I just mentioned. Then a fourth element of how ethics parallel research works is that it includes empirical research. So it's not only philosophy, not only analytical tools, but also empirical research. And then you can think about qualitative research, interviews, focus groups, but also quantitative questionnaires. For example, we did a large study asking patients with cancer whether they would be interested to, when their genome and their tumor would be sequenced genetically, whether they would be interested to hear unsolicited or incidental findings from their DNA sequencing. Then a fifth element is that we always try to involve some way of public participation. And this is because biomedical technologies and also developments in machine learning and the use of data, they not only affect patients or professionals like us, but they affect all people, all citizens involved, and they change how we work, how we have children, and how we also relax. So it's important also to involve the people who are impacted and use the technology. And then finally, we also map the societal impacts or the expected anticipated societal impacts, and we try to include them in the ethical analysis. And well, in this way, we'd like to steer technology in the right direction. And so that is something that I do on a day-by-day basis. I think it's one of the best jobs you can imagine, and I think also the combination with being active both internationally but also in the political domain gives you really a comprehensive view of the interests, legislation and considerations that need to be made by responsible innovation. I look forward to seeing you all at the symposium.
Good morning. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this event. Today, I want to present about a boundary object called the Counterdata set. So to get started, we first need to introduce a recent book that I've co-authored together with Lauren Klein, who's a professor down at Emory University in Atlanta. So our book is called Data Feminism, and I'm going to describe a little bit about the motivation for writing the book and some of the principles that come out of it as a way of setting the scene for what we mean by the Counterdata set. So we see data feminism as part of a growing body of work that's holding corporate and government actors accountable for basically making racist, sexist, and classist data products. So these are things like face detection systems that cannot see women of color, hiring algorithms that demote women's resumes, search algorithms that circulate negative stereotypes about Black girls, all these things and more. And whereas, you know, the era of big data was sort of heralded by this meme that you see here out of The Economist, this idea of data as being the new oil. This is a kind of meme that we characterize as because it's traveled so far and so wide, and you can actually watch mashups of this on YouTube of many people saying this over and over and over again. And the metaphors are sort of apt. So if we think about the metaphors that we apply to extractive industries like oil, where we mine, we capture, we clean, we process, and so on. There's been a growing pushback against this kind of extractive industry notion of data, because like we know with oil, the actual profits that are reaped from such extractive industries tend to benefit the people who are using this metaphor in a kind of a positive way. And this pushback has been coming for maybe the past 5 years and really growing. And this is some of the work that you see on the bottom of the slide that has been inspirational to us as we have written our book. And largely this work the pushback is coming from Black and Indigenous women of color, from white women, from Indigenous people, immigrant communities, LGBTQ people, and more. And in very different ways and in different mediums, they say something like, data is the same old oppression. So in fact, instead of being liberated by our data sets and data systems and our algorithms, we are in fact accelerating and exacerbating existing inequalities in the world. And so what we bring to this conversation with our book is a focus on feminism and intersectional feminism in particular. So we like to be clear about what our definition of feminism is. So feminism is a belief in equal rights for all genders. It's organized activity to realize those rights. And it's also, and I think very excitingly, an intellectual heritage. And it's a heritage that has thought deeply about ethics and inequality. And one very important thing to note is that feminism in the year 2020 must be understood as being intersectional. So this is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and she uses this term to explain how social inequality cannot be explained by one dimension of difference. So we can't only be looking at sexism when we're looking at inequality. We have to talk about the intersection of many forces of oppression that produce it, meaning racism, classism, colonialism, and so on. And this is an important takeaway, because what this means is that intersectional feminism is not only about women. It's not even only about gender. It's about power, thinking about who has power and who does not have power. So our basic argument is that intersectional feminism can help challenge and change the unequal distribution of power that we currently see in data science in so many different ways that we both document in the book and that others have detailed. And in fact, if data science hopes to do what we call good in the world, it actually really needs an intersectional feminist perspective to do that. So the book has 7 principles. There's not really time to go into all of them in a short talk today, but this is more or less how the book is also structured. So we sort of take one principle per chapter, and we try to introduce the feminist thinkers that sort of led to formulating this principle, as well as folks in the world who are using data in the service of realizing that principle. So trying to show that data feminism is something that can be done and is already being done by a variety of folks who are already doing things in the world. So I'm just going to talk about a couple examples and sort of pivot to this idea of the counter data set. So in the book, and this is right in the first chapter, when we're talking about examining power, we tell the story of Mimi Onwoha's efforts to collect what she calls missing data sets. And so she's an artist. And these missing data sets are basically just a list. These are data sets that a reasonable person may expect to exist. So things like the number of citizens killed by police, or the number of men versus women with cases of coronavirus. But these data sets don't exist. So Onwoha takes an analysis of power, this first principle of ours, in her art project, and she asks why. So why do we have detailed data on things like guinea pig teeth, but not police violence? While there's a lot of discussion about bias in data sets and algorithms, we also have to consider which data are not even collected in the first place due to systemic bias. So it's here where I want to introduce the idea that a boundary object for machine learning may be considered as being this counter data set. So in data feminism, we discuss counter data collection as activist data collection that challenges power, meaning it directly challenges racism, sexism, and so on. So counter data sets are collected outside of hegemonic mainstream counting institutions, because their very purpose is to challenge those institutions to see, count, and value something or someone in the world differently. And just to say that when you start looking for counter data sets, you will start to find them everywhere. They're really proliferating in fields like data journalism, for example. And so one area that's very active in terms of counter data collection is COVID data, and specifically COVID data broken down by race, indigenous status, gender, and so on. But the example I want to focus on involves feminicide, and this is the gender-related killing of women and girls. So feminicide in Mexico and basically every other country in the world is another case of missing data sets. Feminicide is legally defined as a crime in 18 countries, including Mexico. And this is thanks to the strength of the Latin American feminist movement. But the state doesn't systematically collect data on the phenomenon, even though they have laws on the books about it. So because of that, this is the subject of emerging public anger in Latin America, because of the way that the state neglects to implement its own laws and provisions. So in the book, we tell the story of Maria Salguero, who she resolved to head straight towards that problem and collect the missing data herself. And she spends 2 to 4 hours a day logging feminicide on a Google map that she calls from media reports. So she has helped families locate loved ones. She's provided data to journalists and NGOs, and she's testified in front of Mexico's Congress multiple times. So in 2019, I was on sabbatical revising data feminism. I was living in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and I started meeting with folks working on the issue of feminicide. And it turns out that Maria Salguero is by no means the only person collecting counter data on feminicide. There are many activists, civil society organizations, and journalists, especially in Latin America, who are doing this work. And it was around this time that I started working with Silvana Fumega at the Latin American Initiative for Open Data and Elena Suarez of the group Feminicidio Uruguay. And so we've since gone on to undertake qualitative and participatory design research with a number of the groups who are doing this counter data collection work. And what's emerging from these interviews is that the counter data sets created by civil society groups and activists are engaged in a back and forth contestational dialogue with many different groups. For example, while feminicide data sets use information from media and government sources, they create alternative categorization and labeling schemes that challenge the framings and the bias in those mainstream reports. And civil society groups' definition of feminicide is often much broader than a legal definition of feminicide, which often limits it to intimate partner violence. And then likewise, families of murdered women serve as both a source of cases for the database, so they often contact activists directly, as well as a key group that activists support. So for example, some groups run programs for grieving families and help them take broader action on the topic and seek justice for their loved ones. And again, the broader social movements coalescing around the topic of gender-based killing serve as both a source for compiling feminicide cases, as well as a key social group that can be mobilized when there's a new case included in the database. So I'd like to leave you today is with the provocation that counter data sets represent a powerful boundary object when we think about participatory machine learning, precisely because they are challenging mainstream, hegemonic, oppressive definitions of a social phenomenon as it has either been described on the one hand or ignored on the other hand in these mainstream data sets. So counter data sets are arguing for bringing into being an alternate political reality, and they should be an important site of participatory design and computational allyship for technologists. Because if we choose to work only with existing data sets created by mainstream counting institutions, we are potentially perpetuating a status quo that is sexist, racist, elitist, and more. So if you're interested in this work, you can check out a series of events that we're organizing this month or email me for a copy of our recent conference paper. Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Nithya Sambasivan. I'm an HCI researcher at Google Research, part of the PAIR team and the Google Research India Lab. And I'm here to talk to you today about data as a boundary object in the ML pipeline. So I'm representing the work of multiple Googlers and collaborators, including Kristen Olsen, Shivani Kapania, and other folks at Google. So data is the critical technical infrastructure of AI. Data largely determines performance, fairness, robustness, safety, and scalability of AI systems. Data sourcing and labeling is an estimated 25 to 60% OpEx cost of ML projects. Paradoxically, for AI researchers and developers, data is often the least incentivized aspect. It is viewed as operational relative to building new models and algorithms. Humans power the ML data pipeline, from data collectors to raters to domain experts to developers. But human experiences and challenges in ML are less understood. As models become more commoditized, AI is increasingly expanding into high-stakes domains where the safety aspect on living beings is high, such as in cancer diagnosis, wildlife detection, and credit assessment. It's not just about cat versus dog detection anymore. Data has often been attacked as a database systems issue, a legal issue, or a licensing issue, but we believe that human-computer interaction has an important role to play in improving ML data quality. So for the past year, we have conducted a systematic study of various actors in the ML data pipeline in multiple parts of the world. We've studied goals, values, practices, processes, and challenges around data of the various groups in the pipeline. Invoking Starr and Griesemer, we put forth that data is a boundary object in ML. It is robust, shared, and yet plastic enough where it is viewed differently along different value alignments by various groups along the pipeline. I will talk to you about this in more detail in a minute, but in brief, data collectors like frontline health workers who power many of the cutting-edge, high-stakes data sets see data as a tool for reporting and program delivery. Data is often orthogonal to their services, sometimes a burden. Raters are measured by their data outputs, making data an economic artifact for them. AI developers use data as code for ML, which then gets implemented into systems that then impact society. So let me start with a key observation of ours, which is that of data cascades in AI. So we define data cascades as compounding events causing negative downstream effects from data issues that result in technical debt over time. In our study of AI developers' data practices in high-stakes AI, we observed prolific data cascades. 92% experienced at least one cascade. 45% experienced two or more cascades. And this is troubling because of the domains that are high stakes that we studied. Data cascades are opaque and largely invisible. They're triggered by conventional ML practices from worlds of big data and viewing data as grunt work. Cascades have negative impacts, including abandoning projects, redoing data collection, and causing user harm. However, in our study, the data cascades were avoidable with intentional processes and practices. So what are some factors causing these cascades? Incentives for novel model development over data rigor, limited data education in AI and ML, and the fact that it's sometimes difficult to create new data sets in cutting-edge AI, and developers often make do with what they can get here. I'll give you two examples of triggers for data cascades. In high-stakes domains, AI systems transition from well-defined and understood environments to brittle deployments closely interacting with the physical world. A conventional ML practice of creating pristine training data sets in development led to system failures in production. So even the smallest of artifacts like fingerprints, shadows, dust on the lens, improper lighting, and pen markings were reported to affect predictions. For example, in our study, a millimeter movement of a camera led to a road safety model failing in production. Another example of a cascade trigger is from the over-reliance on data sense making in social and scientific contexts by AI developers, where they may have lower application domain expertise and engaging poorly with the domain experts here. Questions like, is this a fracture? Is this a village resident or a poacher? Is this a sign of preeclampsia? Actually require domain expertise. Moving to data raters, we find that one of the key aspects of their experience, that is, the rater user interfaces and their tasks, are rather poorly designed. Many people can draw a bounding box, but as AI gets implemented in more complex and subjective domains, the gap between who labels the data and who consumes the AI predictions comes into sharper focus. Labeling can be made more accessible and representative by designing tasks that account for rater environments, time allotments, usability, and speaking the language of data collaborators. For example, rather than providing room for ambiguity, Many UIs today appear to force raters into binary decisions, leading to poor and inaccurate labels. Another example is of how functionality for productivity, like undos to rectify mistakes, providing feedback on tasks, specificity of tasks, pilot testing, and so on, are rather uncommon today. But we need more of these. And finally, on data collectors, as AI enters domains that have been hard to cover for governments and civil society, like COVID tracking and flood forecasting, many data sets come from frontline workers who are a part of NGOs, government services, and field partners like community health workers and microfinance staff. While the workers have pride and prestige in doing good work, data collection for ML is often a burden, coming in the way of their goals and workflows. For example, recording values every few minutes for a medical data set can mean that a patient receives less care. Frontline workers do the invisible work to power high-stakes ML, but they do not reap the benefits of ML capital. Instead, they are underpaid and ignored. Many ML projects in our study did not originally set out to create data literacy or transparency into ML use cases for the data workers. So how can we move to a more proactive focus on data that results in safer and robust systems for all, and one that is grounded in ethics? We call for a shift from doing more with data to doing better with data. We see the use of imperfect and inaccurate system metrics like F1 score used for data quality instead as a proxy, which often measure the wrong thing and are too late to detect and course correct data cascades. How might we develop better data quality metrics, better documentation, and better iterations in model development? How might we take into account the fragility of the real world where things can go wrong fast? We should move from a culture of fear among raters to viewing them as partners. We should make tasks and user interfaces more data worker-centric. How can data collectors benefit from ML revenue and prestige? Today, as it stands, there's an unfortunate lack of involvement and appreciation for application domain expertise in AI and ML. We need to incorporate domain expertise throughout the model development, not just in the problem formulation stage. We also see an opportunity for better tools for data. Several tools today focus on analysis, wrangling, and cleaning, but our research points to an opportunity to support the upstream work of defining dataset requirements and the downstream challenges of monitoring incoming live data, which can lead to data drifts, and measuring the impacts of data on society. We need better incentives for data rigor, including mainstream empiricism, rewarding data glue work in organizations, and reusability of data. Today, ML and data education seem to use toy data sets that are well labeled and West-centric, like US Census data, but we need to train practitioners and researchers more on sourcing, collecting, synthesizing, and labeling their own data sets, which is often a competitive advantage. Thank you.
Wow, hello, welcome back everyone. These were amazing presentations, giving us such different perspectives on the notion of boundary objects, the history of boundary objects, perspectives from data feminism, bioethics, HCI, sort of a lot of work in the field. So I'm very excited to welcome now our panelists, Charlotte, Catherine, Annelien, and Nithya. Please join me. Yay, we're all here. Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for participating in this panel. We are distributed across the world, and so I just wanna thank everyone because Annelien and myself are here in Europe, but the other panelists are in the US and 2 of our panelists are on the west coast of the US, so it's 5 a.m. for them. So thank you for participating. All right, so I would love to start with a question for all of you. Can you think about an example, a concrete example of a powerful boundary object you've seen used in practice? And how has that use led to any change? It doesn't have to be AI related, but any boundary object you've seen used in practice, and what change has it created in the world? Anyone? Who would like to go first?
I'll go first. Yeah, so one of the projects that I worked on was a traffic management study for the city of Seattle and King County in the state of Washington. And we were in a group there trying to create a new, well, they're still working on it, a virtual command center for traffic management in the city, not just accidents, but all of the traffic. And one of the boundary objects that we started working on that we didn't originally have was something from industrial and civil engineering called the concept of operations, which is a whole document, you know, about how do we want the different agencies in the city to work together. And as we started working on it, more people started saying like, oh, well, but we need to talk to somebody else, and we need to also talk to somebody else. And then as new stakeholders came aboard, then the scope of the boundary object changed, as well as the role of it in the project. And so it had a very powerful influence on like everything.
Wow, and a lot of coordination, it seems. Like it just surfaced a lot of different needs for coordination.
Absolutely. A lot of new needs and a lot of existing needs that people haven't really thought much about. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Annelien.
Yes, well, actually, to keep it close to my profession, I think that my whole profession doing ethics research and ethics parallel research in technology is a boundary object. So everybody knows the concept of ethics, but we all communities have different interpretations and conceptions of ethics. Everybody thinks it's important, but we use different classification systems, different normative approaches. There are also power structures are important, as became clear from Catherine's talk. Mm-hmm. So I use the approach of ethics parallel research also as a way of, as a boundary object in order to promote ethical innovation and ethical technologies.
Great. Thank you. And Nithya, do you want to go next?
Yeah, so my interests tend to be focused on communities in the global south. So oftentimes artifacts which are sort of taken for granted in the West have different meanings and different values and implementations for communities in the global south. So a couple of examples such as access to a device and notions around privacy can have very different manifestations. Say with device sharing that is so prominent in many communities, how we think about privacy and security can just be different for different communities around the world. So it's no longer just about online management of privacy, how apps and platforms manifest on one's device, which is shared with other members in that context, also rises into prominence, especially for women. Another example is of how affordances and communication mechanisms in apps and platforms that are quote unquote innocuous in the West can take on very different meanings and forms of abuse through cyber stalking and impersonation and just lead to devastating impact. The same knob or affordance can be used to cause harm to vulnerable communities. And we've shared this work with multiple teams at Google, and it's led to privacy and better measures for counter abuse.
I know that work. Yes, I'm very happy about that work. Catherine.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think keeping with theme of counter data from my presentation, I think one area that's super interesting is when counter data sets, in a sense, become more official data sets. And we sort of see this in the case of the Mexican data, where the one person, Maria Salguero, has ended up collecting what is, in a sense, the most comprehensive public archive about feminicide. And so it's very interesting because while it's not a ground truth, and yet it represents the most comprehensive collection to date. And it's the one that folks can go to and access and so on as a way of tracking. So all these different people, NGOs, activists, families, have used her data set. She's even testified about it back to the state. So even the state is very interested in understanding her data set. It's like a very interesting phenomenon. And like, I guess I would make a parallel here to the COVID data collection situation in the United States, where we have a somewhat compromised national data collection effort happening because they've recently moved data collection from CDC to HHS. And so kind of who knows what's going on with federal COVID data right now. And yet sort of who stepped into that gap is the New York Times and the COVID tracking project. And these have, in a sense, become some of the most authoritative sources, and yet they are counter data collection efforts. They're efforts that this institution is not required to do. They're coming from a kind of accountability and outside perspective. But I think it's really interesting when those become robust enough or comprehensive enough or long enough to start to be regarded as, in a sense, the most authoritative source. So I think there's this kind of interesting line that happens there for me. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and picking up on that theme a little bit, I think you touched on something that I think is fascinating about boundary objects in general, which is just how concrete they are, or the process of getting to something more concrete, right? And I want to say physicality, but I think that's the wrong word, because a lot of these things are digital or are processes, and but just the fact that they exist as artifacts is incredibly important. And it becomes a catalyst, right? For the conversations, for the coordination. As you said, sometimes they're going to become the official things themselves. So my next question, Charlotte, is for you. I really liked how you talked about, the traditional boundary objects, which tend to be unproblematic or static, right? Or tend to be, not necessarily, but they are, I think, more well understood, if you will. And you contrasted that with the epistemic boundary objects, which themselves tend to evolve, right? And so when we think about something, now bringing those notions back to something like AI, when we think about, there's so many concepts that are still fluid and ambiguous. So things like machine learning fairness, the very definition is up for debate. And let alone whether or not we should be using if we should be using what metric we might or may not want to use. So in this sense, one of the takeaways I got from your presentation, but I'm very curious if you agree, is that when you have these boundary objects that are more fluid and they themselves are evolving, are up for debate, it seems like maybe these boundary objects are a little bit more fragile. I don't know. Is that indeed the case? And if it is the case, is there a desire to move from this very fluid state to a more stable state? Or is that not necessarily progress? But I'm just curious, how do you measure progress, I guess, or
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really fascinating. And one of the things that, I hope folks will take away from, our conversation today is that the boundary objects sit within a bunch of practices and a bunch of communities and values. And so, to ask the question about whether a boundary object should be locked down is sort of a question about, should culture change, or should organizations change? Or should people change? It's like, well, sometimes, sometimes a lot of times, right? And so, the question really is, what do we want to achieve? Do we want to achieve opening up a problem space, or do we want to achieve locking down a problem, right? And these two things go together. But when you're doing work, it can be like, well, at this moment in time where we want to do more generative work and a little bit of specifying, and other moments of time we want to do more specifying and less generative work. You can think of a typical design process or a typical project, and then, you know, over a long period of time, you're going to want to be going back and forth between these, right? And sometimes, depending on what's happening in the world, you may be forced to be in a generative state, or you may choose if you want to change like structural relations. So the type of boundary object you want to foster depends on what you're trying to do at the moment. And I think, you know, another, you know, point to that is that depending on what you do, it's not usually going to be, sometimes it's going to be one boundary object that you're thinking about, or whether you're talking about epistemic or technical artifacts, opening or closing boundary objects. But oftentimes when you're doing anything complicated, like you can break it down. So a boundary object can have boundary objects within it. And so which, you know, is annoying because it's more complicated, but it also gives you a lot more play to say, like, these parts I want to hold steady and these parts I want to like.
Nice.
So, yeah.
Great. Thank you. Annelien, you have done extensive work in bioethics, in the bioethics sector. What are some of the proven boundary objects and best practices, if you will, in bioethics that you think we should consider adopting in AI?
Well, thank you. Well, actually, all artifacts that are used in medicine and all technologies that are adopted can be considered boundary objects. And I think a very recent example that I've been studying is the concept of organoids or organoids technology. And organoids are three-dimensional mini organs. It's a bunch of cells that mimics human organs, like a mini gut or a mini liver or mini brains. And we've been studying actually what actually is, from a conceptual point of view, an organoid, and does it have any moral status? Should it have legal status? And interesting enough, we have done extensive studies with different stakeholders. And there you could see that, for example, the researchers who are developing those organoids, which are made from tissue, stem cells from patients, they say, well, it's just a bunch of cells, and we use them, we multiply them, and we can sell them to companies and collaborate. And for them, they are an interesting tool to model human disease. On the other hand, the donors and patients that we've interviewed, they said, well, that it's a part of our body and our identity. It has our DNA, and it mimics, when we give pharmaceuticals to those organoids in a dish, it does the same as in our bodies. So they have a complete different conception of the organoid. And for examples, the researchers say this is useful for personalized medicine, but they see personalized medicine also different from the patients who think with personalized medicine, it's about it's healthcare for them. And it's also interesting because in the end, we presented organoids as hybrids. They are neither objects or subjects. They have characteristics of both. They are both disentangled from the human body, but also entangled because they represent the body's DNA. And actually, by doing this analysis, we run a program for a couple of years in collaboration with the International Society for Stem Cell Research, and we were able to propose ethical guidelines for using and also distributing human organoids, because they are used worldwide in laboratories and companies worldwide. And I think this is an approach to, in the end, advance biomedicine, because I think that is everybody wants, but we don't want to exploit patients and donors.
This is fascinating, I have to say, the organoids. And it feels a little bit, I'm sure it's not the best analogy, but to me, it kind of feels like a simulation of you know, a much more complex system in a sense, because you don't have the entire body, as you said, it's separated, it's isolated. Yeah. But it's interesting, right? Because in a sense, it's data, it's information from the body, right?
True. Yes, that's true. And I think the how we now perceive the body as a source for with using wearables, with DNA sequencing. We can even make stem cells and gametes out of just human tissue. So I think the making a source out of a body is a very important object to study. Also, if you want responsible innovation in those fields. And I think there are many similarities with the development of AI, particularly in healthcare, but also in a broader sense. Because there we have actually exactly the same discussions. Now there are many AI-driven decision support systems, for example, in image-based medicine, where the pathologist and radiologist have discussion about what is expertise, because we were the persons who are doing a medical case and giving expert advice, but now we don't know that an algorithm is more accurate in identifying, for example, tumors. But it's not accurate in feeling the narrative of the patient. So it's there we have we're running a program about actually human or clinician and AI interaction, which is also fascinating.
Nice. Okay. I want to come back to that if we have time. Thank you. Catherine, you, I thought that the counter data set example is a very impressive one. And so one of the things I'm curious about is, in practice, how do you think counter data sets should start being used in machine learning? You know, in an ideal world, what are some of the specific applications that you think could benefit the most from this kind of much richer, more textured data that you spoke about?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think the thing that I would say would be more around not necessarily what knowledge we might get from using counter data sets, but maybe what knowledge we might get from collaborating with counter data collectors, I guess, in the sense that from what I've seen, generally speaking, and this is obviously not universally true, but I think a lot of times in technical communities, we like to collaborate. When we collaborate with experts, we collaborate with institutions, and there's a lot of good reasons for that. But I think when institutions fail us, and I think they are failing us in many ways, when we think about racism, sexism, et cetera, these long-standing, enduring problems of social inequality, this is when it's time to look to the folks who are doing the work in those areas and look to collaborating with them. And so I think that's where I think the most knowledge is to be gained, is in thinking about who do we collaborate with when we're building technologies, for whom are these systems, and how do we, so because in my opinion, a healthy democracy is a place that we make space for dissent, we make space for contestation. This is how things work, this is how things change. And so thinking about what is the role of machine learning and AI in really fostering a healthy civic information ecosystem. So if we're thinking about how do we foster the collection of counter data sets, the use of counter data sets by the people who are actually poised to sort of use them, right? I think that would be maybe the question, or the answer that I would say. So it's more a question of whose expertise and position do we value, and how do we build stronger relationships with them, and really kind of value the work that they're doing, not only from the standpoint of whatever the issue is, but also from the standpoint of healthy information ecosystems, healthy accountability industries, basically.
Yeah, and sort of, as you said, what are the blind spots we don't even know we have? And it's going to be hard to figure that out if we don't broaden the set of stakeholders that we work with, or collaborators, as you said, right? Okay. Nithya, as you said, you've been working a lot. A lot of your work focuses on the global South, and as we know, these are not the communities that usually are involved from the start on a lot of the cutting edge work that is happening, right? And yet a lot of times we also, as you showed in your presentation, depend on a lot of those communities to get a lot of the work done, especially around data collection. So I want to go back to data collection in a moment, but I am also very curious if you could say anything about the work, the nuances that you've been seeing affecting things like fairness and notions of machine learning fairness that are not, they're non-Western, if you will. They're not your mainstream, part of your mainstream conversation.
Great question, thanks. So taking a step back, right, the communities in the global South, are today utilized to power the AI models that we're using all over the world, but are also increasingly attracting a lot of investment because they comprise a large technology user base, right? So both from the user side as well as the production and powering of these data sets and models. So fairness is actually really relevant to talk about here because there's been so much progress in the space of ML fairness, but predominantly centered in the West, right? So subgroups like race and gender, measurement scales like the Fitzpatrick scale, optimization techniques based on US civil laws. But fairness is highly contextual. We can't copy paste and apply it to everywhere in the world. And in fact, we are finding in our research that several of the assumptions made in conventional fairness can be inappropriate or even harmful to communities in India, which is where we've been focusing a lot. And that's because the distance between a model and a community is very large in a country like India because of distances of technical distance, of temporal distance, physical distance, emotional distance that come in the way of communities actually benefiting from these models. So simply optimizing fair model outputs can be a tokenism because the communities may never benefit from ML systems. Without the right mechanisms and safeguards. There's a few factors to consider here as to why some of these assumptions get challenged. One is that of data misses and distortions, right? So there is a notion in fairness that if we fix the data, we fix the bias. That data is actually representative of people and phenomena. But that's often not the case. For example, in India, half of the country is not online. So when you only have one half that's online, that's the privileged half that's online, it already skews towards specific communities. And the ML problems that are being worked on today are rather rich people problems, cancer and heart disease rather than tuberculosis, the poor people's problems. And we also see other factors, like there's a lot of human-mediated data collection, which I reference in the talk on the data collector and the rater parts. So there's a very rich human infrastructure, like community health workers, that are also used to collect data that powers ML data sets, in addition to their daily responsibilities of delivering healthcare to communities. And that, leads to different questions like, is consent to a health worker transitive to an ML model in the downstream uses of that data? We also see that, this assumption, which is so prevalent in tech, of this one-to-one correspondence of
user to a data point. That is, a data point is a faithful representation of a unique user, actually gets challenged because of practices like shared device usage. And proxies can take on different implementations. Like a name is the most semantically meaningful proxy in India. It can represent caste, gender, religion, ethnicity, and class. And zip codes, for example, are heterogeneous. Right? You might have slum communities abutting with posh communities, and that's a little different from the West, where it's fairly homogeneous because of histories of redlining. So data, by examining data, we see that it's no longer a simplistic, faithful representation of the people or the phenomena we're trying to capture. But there are also other factors that are important to consider in fairness. For example, recourse is very poor for communities of the global south, right? Because of all these distances. So when user bias is reported, it's not quite acted upon by ML research or by the ML industry. And finally, AI is so new in many parts of the world that many high stakes AI deployments are actually embraced often too early. It plays this aspirational role in economic development of different nations, right? We call AI, countries manufacturing AI superpowers. This is highly masculine space. In India, for example, there is a facial recognition service used in New Delhi, which has very low accuracy. There's one report that it has 1% accuracy, which is being used in implementation. So solutions may be adopted a little too early without having the right tools and mechanisms to be able to scrutinize these models. So we often see an end-to-end opacity, not just model explainability issues, but we don't know what the data sets are, what the model behavior is, what the inferences are. So we need a broader ecosystem as well as a set of tools to actually be able to understand the fairness impacts of these systems.
Okay, thank you. So I hate to say this, but we are running out of time, and I wanna do a very quick, if you're all are up for it, a very quick round of a call to action. So as we saw, there are many problems, all the way from who are we leaving out to even when we are counting things, we're counting things probably the wrong way. There are many challenges, shall we say. But I would love to turn our minds now to the future and sort of what is the hope for the future. I wanted to ask you each for what is your call to action? As you think about the need to do better, what kind of boundary object do you hope is in the future for the AI community? Charlotte, please go first.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are many wonderful opportunities. I think going back to my comments about looking at the boundary objects that are for collaborative sense making is a huge opportunity. So when you think about, like choosing which training data sets to use, how to have open up a space for conversation so people can discuss how to tweak how the algorithms are functioning and whether they fit how the communities think. I think there's huge opportunities there to open up the machine learning to this dialogue. It's just that we have to have those conversations in different places in the workflow than we did before.
Great, thank you. Catherine.
Yeah, thanks. I was really appreciating what Nithya was saying, and it was making me think of, I read a great paper recently called Against Scale. It was just making me think how some of our inherited assumptions in technology are really hobbling us from actually doing good work in the space. So my closing thought was just to say that, this is something we say in the book as well, but things like history and context matter so much more than things like size and scale. And these are, we inherit this idea that more data are better data. that we need to scale something immediately. So I think my call to action is to say, have the courage to work small and to integrate technologies appropriately in collaboration with folks. And then I don't think scaling is impossible, but we can scale with coalitions and with collective action that's sort of mutually beneficial rather than forcing scale on populations where it's not appropriate.
Thank you. Annelien.
My call for action, and that may not be surprising, would be to submit the development of machine learning and other digital technology to democratic scrutiny. Because if it's part of the legislative process, then you are guaranteed that there will be checks and balances, that minority views will be incorporated, that there will be a public or at least a political discussion about which values need to be integrated in machine learning and other technologies. And I think it should be part and subjected to the public domain. And a very short example was the development of the COVID-19 tracing app in the Netherlands. As a senator, I was the spokesperson for my political party, and we decided that it should be subjected to a law. So there is now a specific tracing app law in the Netherlands. And this is because there was a lot of, from the people, the public emphasized that they were afraid for a surveillance society where the public is surveying them when they are using the app. People were distrusting the collaboration with data companies who were facilitating actually the development of the app. The government was saying, oh, but we're doing the right thing because we are following the general data protection regulation. So a very formalistic answer. And there was a lot of discussion about what is an ethical app. And I think making a law of it was the right way to do. And now we have a law and we have an app, which actually works fine.
Wonderful. Thank you. Nithya.
My call to action is very much along the lines of Catherine, Charlotte, and Annelien. It is to examine the end-to-end impacts of AI systems, right? How AI systems are conceived, produced, appropriated, and contested. AI is flawed and imperfect, and the use of metrics like F1 score and accuracy do not actually capture the impacts that these systems have on people, on living beings. As I talk about in the data cascades work, the use of system level metrics do not actually correspond to how good the data is, or whether the data collection process was fair, or whether it can cause long-term harms to communities. And even if we have a 100% accurate system, these systems are impacting people's lives. And so we need to be constantly evaluating them and asking if we're disempowering people, if they're being used for surveillance, if communities have a chance to contest, and so on.
Okay. Well, thank you so much to the four of you for spending this time with us, for sharing your thoughts and your experience and your knowledge. I loved the panel. I learned a ton. And thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for waking up early and staying with us throughout this.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so everyone on the live stream, in about 15 minutes, maybe a little bit less because our panel went 5 minutes over, we're going to start the breakout sessions. So if you are in one of those breakout sessions, you should have gotten an email. So please, in about 15 minutes, that's when that is going to start. Next, I just wanted to remind you that the next panel is happening in Boston, and it's about objective functions as a boundary object. And it's being led by my colleague, Martin Wattenberg, and another amazing set of speakers. And then later on today, finishing our program, we have the third panel happening in Seattle, and it's going to focus on participatory ML boundary objects in practice. And that's going to be led by my colleague, Jess Holbrook. And next Please keep the conversation going. Here are some of the URLs where you can find more of Pierre's work. And the symposium recordings will be available on the YouTube channel as well. And next, that's it for me. Thank you very much for staying with us and watching. And please stay tuned for the rest of the day. Bye, everyone.